Barakata Yahweh, Barakata Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Rakahakwadash, Barakatum. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, glory, and infinite honors to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai. Double honors to the apostles and elders, a great millstone who ruled and teach well. In peace and salutations to you sincere Akim out there, pushing this word in truth and sincerity to the four corners of the globe. May you brothers endure until the end. This is the Brother Ra'aya with another video, and in this video I'll be profiling an article from TheGuardian.com titled 12 Million Americans Believe Violence is Justified to Restore Trump to Power. University of Chicago research finds support for violence to achieve political goals and general distrust of democracy. And Donald Trump's presidency or re-election or the January 6th incident aside, what I mainly want to deal with in this article is the fact that increasing numbers of Americans out here are doubting democracy, doubting the politicians that run the government, just doubting this American system in general. And this is all a part of biblical prophecy. And there will be civil unrest in the United States of America, where Americans, especially these American Edomites or so-called white people from all walks of life, are going to be going at each other's throats and killing each other. This is Isaiah chapter 19, verse 2. And I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians. And this isn't talking about the ancient Egyptians or Mizraim, who were Hamites, so-called Africans. This is talking about these modern-day spiritual Egyptians, these American Edomites, because as pursuant to Revelation 11, verse 8, America is spiritual Egypt and Sodom. And I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians, Americans against the Americans, and they shall fight, everyone against his brother and everyone against his neighbor, city against city and kingdom against kingdom. And as we'll see in that article, again, ever-increasing numbers of Americans are becoming distrustful of the system, and it's eventually going to boil over into violence. Two and a half years ago, after the January 6th attack on the Capitol, an estimated 12 million American adults, or 4.4%, a very significant number of the adult population, believe violence is justified to restore Donald Trump to the White House. Though the number of adults who believe this has declined since the insurrection, recent survey data from the University of Chicago reveal alarming and dangerous levels of support for political violence and conspiracy theories across the United States, because more and more people out here are starting to wake up to the fact that we live in a corrupt system and democracy is a joke, and these political leaders don't have their best interests at heart, but have the best interests of the elites who they get their marching orders from at heart. The university's Chicago Project on Security and Threats, CPOST Research Center, has been conducting dangers to democracy surveys of American adults on political violence and attitudes towards democracy since shortly after the January 6th attacks. In new data from April shared exclusively with The Guardian, researchers found a continued support for violence to achieve various political goals on both sides of the aisle and a general distrust for democracy. Hey, again, I will set and they shall fight everyone against his brother and everyone against his neighbor. Hey, Edomites from all walks of life are at odds with each other. This is the most divided the country's ever been. You've got the Republicans versus the Democrats. You've got so-called straight Edomites against those in the alphabet group. There's generational divides with the Gen Zers and millennials looking at the baby boomers as the cause for all the economic problems they're dealing with right now. Men versus women with MGTOW versus feminism. So-called religious Edomites against atheistic Edomites. Class warfare with the rich looking at the poor and more political divides with your average everyday Americans looking at the Edomites in the government as the root cause of all their problems and taking away their liberties and their freedoms. And it's eventually going to boil over into chaos in the streets of America. The results are particularly alarming as the 2024 election approaches without essential safeguards that some lawmakers say could help prevent another attack on U.S. democracy. And if we even get to the 2024 presidential elections, which Abarat Dazai we don't, it's going to be very interesting to see what the buildup to it is going to be, with political rhetoric flaring up, talks of political violence, these people getting more and more entrenched in their political beliefs. And as we're seeing in this article, more and more Americans are believing that political violence can solve issues, and also see what kind of FFs, which you should know by now what that means, that the government is going to push to further rile up things and blame it on domestic teas or so-called white supremacist groups or any other type of extremist groups out here. So-called. For the next year and a half through the 2024 election, CPost will be releasing new survey data tracking continued dangers to democracy every 3 months. The data will be published first with The Guardian. This data will be critical at a time when efforts to erode democracy feel increasingly prevalent in the United States, from candidates who deny the results of their elections to governmental task forces attempting to prosecute people who unintentionally violate voting laws. We're heading into an extremely tumultuous election season, said Robert Pape, a professor at the University of Chicago who directs CPost. What's happening in the United States is political violence is going from the fringe to the mainstream. The most recent survey from April 2023 found that an estimated 142 million Americans, about a third of the country, believe that elections won't solve America's most fundamental problems. So if elections and the right to vote in the democratic way won't solve America's problems, what's the other option? Up, so an increase from 111 million last September, and 1 in 5 American adults still believe that the 2020 election was stolen from Trump, representing a very little change from 2021. And here's an infographic. What you're seeing is really disturbing levels of distrust in American democracy, support for dangerous conspiracy theories, and support for political violence itself, Pape said. And what does it say? Let's get it. Mark chapter 3, verses 24 to 25. And if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house be divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And when we see informations and polls like this coming out, and we can clearly see that this kingdom of the United States of America is divided. And within that, the house of these Edomites, or so-called white people, is divided. Like I said earlier, damn near at every level, every walks of life, these Edomites are divided on some political, gender, religious, economic issue. And as it says, if either be divided, that kingdom or that house cannot stand. We're living in the twilight hours, the end of the rulership of you Edomites, chiefly in the United States of America, before your entire nation goes down and you go into slavery in the kingdom of heaven under the true children of Israel, the so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans, who that kingdom, the Southern Kingdom, or the so-called Negroes, as well as the Northern Kingdom, or the so-called Latinos and Native Americans, the elect of the nation of Israel, of all 12 tribes coming together in unison, being united. Pape said it was important to track sentiments about political violence, comparing it to kindling for a wildfire. Though many were unaware that the events on January 6th would turn violent, which that's a whole nother topic in itself. But when you really dig deep into that situation, there's more to it than meets the eye. Research shows that public support for violence was widespread, so the attacks themselves should not have come as a surprise. Once you have support for violence in the mainstream, those are the raw ingredients, or the raw combustible material, and then speeches, typically by politicians, can set them off, he said. Or if they get going, speeches can encourage them to go further. Before the January 6th insurrection, there was chatter online forums and among far-right groups about potential political violence when Congress met to count electoral votes and certify Joe Biden the winner of the presidential election. But it was Trump's speech at the White House, ellipse, that day that touched off the actual violence, Pape said. Here's another infographic. Belief that the use of force is justified to restore Trump to the presidency has declined. That's why it's important to track public sentiment about political violence regularly. The instigating event, usually a speech or comment by a person in power, is unpredictable and can set off at any moment, but the underlying support for violence is more predictable and trackable. The survey found that almost 14%, a minority of Americans, but still a significant number, believe the use of force is justified to achieve political goals that I support. And I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians, and every man shall fight against his brother, against his neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. More specifically, 12.4% believe it's justified to restore the federal right to infant deletion. 8.4% believe it's justified to ensure members of Congress and other government officials do the right thing. 6.3% think it's justified to preserve the right of so-called white Edomite Americans, and 6.1% believe it's justified to prevent the prosecution of Trump. And that's interesting where it said 8.4% believe it's justified to ensure members of Congress and other government officials do the right thing. And I did a lesson about a year or two ago showing that with each passing year, talks and threats of violence towards those in the government has been increasing. And as these people continue to see that our so-called elected leaders don't have their best interests in heart, what do you think that's going to turn to? Hey, they're going to try to physically force them through political violence to get these leaders to do right. And if they don't want to do right, what do you think's going to happen? Off with their head. That's all a part of biblical prophecy as well. This is 2 Esdras chapter 15 in the Apocrypha. I'm going to start at verse 15. For the sword in their destruction draweth nigh, and one people shall stand up and fight against another. And that one people standing up and fighting against another can go into many things. One race of people standing up and fighting against another, as it says in Matthew chapter 24, verse 7, for nation shall rise against nation. There will be racial skirmishes in this country. One political group of people fighting against another, red versus blue, Republican versus Democrat, class warfare with the rich versus the poor, and political warfare with the average everyday Americans. You know, these so-called patriots and freedom fighters going against those in the government shall stand up and fight against another, and swords in their hands. And especially in the United States of America, that modern day sword is the gun. Verse 16, for there shall be sedition among men. And the definition for that word sedition is conduct or speech inciting rebellion against a ruling authority or monarch. And as we're reading that article on online forums and just in general, there's more and more talks about the use of political violence to achieve one's goals to make America so-called great again, and invading one another, so physical action taking place. They shall not regard their kings nor princes, and your modern day kings and princes are those in the government. mayors, governors, senators, presidents, prime ministers, etc., as well as the authorities that uphold the system, such as the military or the police. Once the situations are truly bad enough in this country, economic collapses, food shortages, possible blackouts, you name it, eventually that pot is going to boil over, and these people are not going to regard their kings nor princes and invade one another and take actions into their own hands, as it's about to say, and the course of their actions shall stand in their power. And here's another infographic. Political actions that a minority of Americans believe justify the use of force. 13.9% believe achieve political goals that I support. 12.4% restore the federal right to infant deletion. 8.4% ensure members of Congress and other government officials do the right thing, etc. Now I'm going to close down this little part right here. In addition to wide support for Trump's big lie about the 2020 election, the survey also found that significant numbers of American adults believe conspiracy theories about the U.S. government, and the number of believers has remained steady over almost 2 years. For example, 10% of American adults in April said they believe the government is run by Satan-worshiping pedophiles. And clearly, with just these agendas that are getting pushed out here by the government and even Hollywood, we can see that this is the case. So again, the United States of America is continuing to be divided on every level. And as it said, a kingdom that be divided against itself cannot stand. And it's ultimately going to culminate in these Egyptians fighting against the Egyptians in the streets of America with swords or guns in their hands. So that's it with this video. And with this video, I hope you sincere Akim and Akwath were edified. Hey, just keep strong. We're almost out of this final wicked captivity of the heathen nations, chiefly of the Edomites. And as always, I'm going to say Abad Babol, Kwam Yasharallah, and until next time, Shalom.